if as a result of the Opium War, China had become the world's largest consumer, putting its own existence at risk, decades later, warlords connected to Chinese secret societies, the Triads, would occupy the Golden Triangle and Tibet region to produce opium, making China, from being the largest consumer, also become the largest exporter. In other words, now the spell had turned against the sorcerer, and international drug trafficking like never before would spread throughout the world. The British Empire, without knowing it, had opened this box and created international organized crime. And closing that box would be practically impossible. In today's video, we're going to see how Chinese organized crime would create international drug trafficking, a factor that would trigger the emergence of thousands of other criminal organizations around the world. But before that, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Or you can subscribe to our Telegram channel to stay up to date with updates from our channel. And also consider sharing the video with everyone you know. The channel is small, so your support in this way is essential for me to keep bringing you real content about history, organized crime, intelligence, and genuine geopolitics here for you. My name is Geopolitica Mundial, and this is Geopolitica Mundial. In the midst of the post-Opium War chaos in China, the Chinese imperial state was fragmented and weakened. And with that, a series of forces parallel to the state began to grow, taking on the role that should have belonged to the Chinese state, such as criminal factions, secret societies, and even the generals of the armed forces, who instead of defending the interests of the Chinese nation, used this military power for their own advantage, the so-called warlords. But in the midst of this confusion of groups and organizations, some stood out, especially the Chinese Triads, which is complicated to call criminal factions due to some of their characteristics. It would be more accurate to call them secret societies, although they were neither secret nor even discreet at that time. The history of the Chinese Triads is complex, with several different theories and interpretations about their origin and development. However, many scholars agree that the Triads emerged in the 17th century as a resistance movement against the Manchu invasion in China. Those stories that they come from ancient times, which is very common in movies, are basically fantasy and have no scientific basis. Therefore, according to the oldest information that reached the West, the Chinese Triads initially had many similarities with Western Freemasonry, although they are distinct in their own traditions, ceremonies, and symbolism. And this led British diplomats and military officers like Herbert Gills and William Stanton, or European priests like John Mallory Ward, to mistakenly believe that these similarities meant they had the same origin as Freemasonry. A fact that, in a few decades, would prove to be false, with some aspects being mere coincidence and others the result of translation errors. According to William Stanton, the origin of the Triads can be traced back to the surviving leaders of the Ming dynasty, who took refuge in a monastery in the mountains to escape the Manchus. After successive battles against the Manchus, these surviving monks founded the Heaven and Earth Association, or Chang'e in Chinese, the first Triad faction. This organization was focused on resisting the oppression of the Manchu officials. Anyway, the Chinese Triads became known as criminal organizations over time, getting more and more involved in illegal activities such as drug trafficking, gambling, prostitution, and human smuggling. And at the same time, these secret societies were also responsible for altruistic actions and mutual aid among their members, such as providing financial help and support to the communities where their members lived. One of the effects of the Opium War, as we saw in the previous video, was extreme poverty and war, which led to millions of Chinese people fleeing from China. These millions of poor and desperate Chinese people would be seen by the British Empire as a new opportunity, a cheap labor force that could work for the empire in building infrastructure in Southeast Asia. Other Chinese people, however, ventured even farther, including to the west coast of the United States, during the period of the westward expansion, the Old West, where they flooded the cities of San Francisco and Los Angeles and were responsible for construction work, working in the mines and building the railroads that connected California with the rest of the country. And not only there, but also in New York, where they would work in textile factories as well as in London and other cities around the world. The Chinese community stood out for being efficient in their work, disciplined, dedicated, and above all, very cheap, which obviously would lead to cultural and economic clashes with the native populations. In some cases, even violent ones like the Rock Springs Massacre, where local miners, unhappy with the presence of cheap Chinese labor, massacred the small local community. This factor caused the Chinese to isolate themselves in their own neighborhoods to protect themselves against aggression, both from natives and from other immigrant groups, and even the authorities, thus forming the famous Chinatowns. And in these neighborhoods, the local city police usually avoided going in. And this would lead to the formation of another secret organization that would eventually organize these neighborhoods, the so-called Tongs. So the situation we had was as follows. In China and Southeast Asia, Triad groups controlled the underworld. Far from there, and spread across other continents in Chinese neighborhoods, were the Tongs. These organizations were not a single entity and didn't even have centralized leadership. Each region had its own faction, and this made it nearly impossible for the authorities at the time to fight these organizations. In fact, in some cases, the authorities even tolerated and made agreements with the Triad and Tong groups. For example, the British authorities in Malaysia couldn't communicate with or coordinate these Chinese populations who had emigrated due to the language and cultural barriers, and there were often rebellions among these Chinese communities. Therefore, the Triad leaders were reluctantly accepted as they could control these rebellions and were also able to coordinate Chinese workers for jobs on railways, in industries, on farms, and wherever they were needed. In other words, the Triad leaders, even though they challenged the European colonial authorities with their drug trafficking, were at least able to maintain peace and stability and keep the Chinese workers working. In other words, they were a necessary evil in the eyes of the colonial authorities. But the Triad's network of connections went much further, spread throughout China and all the European colonies in Asia, whether in Malaysia, Hong Kong, and Myanmar with the British, Macau with the Portuguese, Indonesia with the Dutch, the Philippines with the Spanish, or Indochina with the French. It didn't matter. The Triad leaders were gaining more and more wealth and power. This happened alongside the power of the European powers, who were torn between fighting organized crime, which could mean having millions of Chinese people in their hands who might erupt in rebellion, or tolerating them to maintain peace. European imperialism in Asia had indeed created two monsters that the Europeans didn't know how to contain. In public, the rising Japanese Empire, and in the underworld, invisibly, Chinese organized crime. And this would get worse in 1911 with the collapse of the Qin dynasty, the end of the Chinese Empire, and the emergence of the Republic of China. This episode, in fact, demonstrates the strength of the Chinese Triads. Sun Yat-sen, the father of the Republic of China, revered today both by mainland China and the Chinese Communist Party, as well as in Taiwan, was a strong advocate for political reforms in China. Inspired by the model of equal democracy in the United States, Sun Yat-sen had the ambition to transform the Chinese Empire into a kind of United States of China. Sun would have his first attempt at revolution in 1895 with the first uprising in Guangzhou. However, with its failure, Sun became the #1 enemy of the Chinese Empire and hurriedly fled China, heading to England, where he was eventually captured by Chinese spies and held prisoner at the Chinese embassy in London, being released only after negotiations with representatives of the British government. In any case, Sun knew it was only a matter of time before he was arrested or assassinated. He then fled again, this time to Canada, but it was no use as the Qing spies remained on his trail. And then he decided to go to Japan, where the Chinese presence was contained by the Japanese authorities. And who coordinated Sun Yat-sen's escape and helped him bring money for his campaigns against the Qing dynasty in China? The Chinese Triads, of which Sun Yat-sen was a member. This made it clear that the Chinese Triads were not merely a criminal organization involved in drug trafficking, but more than that, the Triads were secret organizations that wanted to manipulate the future of China. Furthermore, in Japan, Sun was protected and assisted by Totem Miyazaki, a Japanese philosopher connected to the Japanese Empire's intelligence service and Japanese secret societies who saw in Sun Yat-sen a way to weaken China. But that's a topic for another video. Back to Sun, with the money raised by these organizations and by Chinese immigrants outside of China, and with Triad contacts infiltrated in the Chinese government, Sun Yat-sen finally decided to return to China. And to avoid being arrested, he was received and escorted by thousands of Chinese Triads, not allowing any government authority to get close to him to kill or arrest him. Thus beginning the Chinese Revolution of 1911 that I mentioned, which without the help of the Triads would never have happened the way it did. After Sun's death in 1925, the new government of Chiang Kai-shek faced enormous difficulties in effectively governing the country, which was increasingly plunged into political disorder. Thus, the secret society called the Green Gang, of which Chiang Kai-shek was a member, emerged as a powerful organization that acted in favor of the nationalist government against the communist movements. In addition, the Green Gang, which was connected to the Triads, was the first organization to get involved in the production and distribution of modern drugs such as morphine and heroin. This was a new and profound step in international drug trafficking, as it was an escalation beyond the opium trade. Morphine arrived in China at the beginning of the century, being manufactured from opium and brought in by Europe, the United States, and Japan. Initially, it was used as a medicine to reduce the dependence of opium addicts, but over time it was discovered that it was even more addictive than opium itself. And heroin, in turn, was invented by the British in 1874, and although it was considered dangerous, it ended up being marketed as a popular medicine in the United States and Europe. When restrictions on the import and manufacture of heroin were imposed in these countries, production then shifted to China, where secret societies began to manufacture it in clandestine laboratories in Shanghai and Tianjin. And later, through the international networks of Chinese criminal organizations, they began to distribute it to the world. As I mentioned earlier, Chinatowns were Chinese neighborhoods that the police avoided entering out of disdain for the Chinese. And therefore, these neighborhoods ended up becoming the selling and distribution points for heroin, which was resold to various criminal organizations. In Europe, the drug was sold to European crime syndicates, like the Mafia in southern Italy, the Union Corps in France, gangs in London in England, the Hingvereini in Germany, while in the United States with Irish clans, with the Jewish Mafia, and with the Italian Mafia. The Chinatowns were literally hubs, distribution centers for heroin. If the British Empire and the East India Company 50 years earlier had gotten the Chinese addicted to opium, this had now caused the unintended effect of Chinese criminal factions sending heroin back, much more powerful than opium to Europeans and Americans. With the explosion of drug trafficking and under pressure from conservative and religious American groups who protested against American interference in Chinese affairs and attacked the immorality of what had happened in the Opium War, the United States government felt compelled to pressure Europeans and the Chinese government to criminalize drug trafficking. But anyway, now it was too late. After all, drug traffickers in China were no longer hidden second-class citizens, but rather part of the very system of Republican power and economy, especially in the already mentioned Green Gang. The relationship between the Chinese Republican government and organized crime was not just about corruption. They were an important part of the Kuomintang's war funding against the communists in the north and against the Japanese in northeastern China. Besides, without having an actual espionage agency, the ones who carried out espionage and strategic assassinations were drug traffickers, pirates from the South China Sea, prostitutes, and thieves. And all of them were coordinated and led by the shadowy Kuomintang Lieutenant General and Chiang Kai-shek's right-hand man, General Dai Li, one of the most powerful and mysterious figures ever to exist in the history of the entire underworld. In any case, the international heroin trafficking network was now established, with distribution points in North America, Europe, and Southeast Asia. It was the first truly transnational and global institution, but now it would take on a corporate form at a more professional level than anyone could ever have imagined in a criminal organization. It's no coincidence that in the most business-oriented country in the world, the United States, which at that time, at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, was a real chaos of immigrants from various parts of the world. And now the situation would reach unprecedented levels, as the Italian, American, and Jewish mafias would join forces to dominate the underworld and the backstage of politics in the United States. But we'll leave that for the next video in the series, The History of Organized Crime. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, leave your like and share the video with everyone you know. And a huge super mega thank you to the channel members. This channel's small size limits its monetization. I can only continue providing geopolitical and historical content. Thanks to the members who contribute a lot to the channel. So if you can and you like the channel, consider becoming a member. Not only will you get access to our exclusive live streams, but also to the courses that I'm gradually making available for members. But if you can't become a member, that's okay. Share the video with everyone you know. That helps a lot, much more than you can imagine. Thank you all, hugs, and see you in the next video.